pigskin fans out there. Tonight's presentation is on nutritional management, and you might look at that title and say, what is she going to talk about? What I'm going to talk about tonight is kind of going to be a result of the first three presentations. You know, the first session we talked about basically how ruminant nutrition works, how different feeds affect the rumen. The second session was on the nutrients that they require. Last week, Jeff talked about the feedstuffs that provide the nutrients. These next two sessions, we're going to talk about taking that information and applying it to our operations to feed our livestock. Tonight, I'm going to talk what I'm going to say more in generic terms, kind of a practical feeding. Next week, Willie's going to talk about balancing rations. You know, actually looking at not, oh, well, we should feed him this, should I feed him more? We can actually look at the nutrient tables, the feedstuff tables, the weights of our animals, and truly balance rations and tell you exactly what you should be feeding. So tonight I'm going to talk more in like I said, in general terms, in terms of how we apply this previous knowledge to actually feeding our livestock. And we've already talked about the fact that the nutrient requirements change because they're affected by the animal goes through different stages in its life, different stages in production. So those nutrient requirements frequently change. For a female, they change every year, throughout the year. For a wether or a ram, they're mostly the same. For a pet wether, they're always the same. For a ram or a buck, they're going to change just basically during breeding season. So they're affected by a lot of different things, and they will constantly change. The other thing we talked about is the fact that livestock require nutrients, not specific feedstuffs. I could actually say that sheep and goats do not need pasture, and I'm going to put an or between all these sentences. They do not need hay. They do not need grain. We can use a lot of different feedstuffs to meet their needs. What they need are the 6 nutrients that we talked about in the second session. They need water, they need energy or carbohydrates, they need protein, they need fats, they need vitamins, they need minerals. And while fiber is technically not a nutrient, it is an important aspect of feeding a ruminant. They need a certain amount of roughage in their diet to stay healthy. Anytime we go away from a high roughage diet to a more concentrated diet, we need to give the rumen time to adjust. So fiber, while not technically a nutrient, is very important. The other thing we need to always remember is that livestock require quantities, not percentage of nutrients. So if somebody asks me, well, what should I feed my doe? To tell you to feed her 16% protein feed would be doing you a disservice, because that's not what she requires. She requires so many pounds or grams or kilograms of protein and energy. She requires an amount. So on our bigger nutrients like energy and protein, we usually talk about pounds or kilograms. Some of our more sophisticated measurements of energy, we actually use calories. For our macro minerals, which are the ones they require in a higher amount, that would be like salt, calcium, phosphorus. Those are usually grams per day that they require. The micro minerals, which would be something like selenium, very, very important mineral, but they require it in very small amounts, usually parts per million. And then vitamins you'll sometimes see in international units. So if you look up nutrient tables for what an animal needs, it's going to be an amount, not a percentage. And yet we do talk about percentages a lot. And you will find percentage recommendations all over the place in books and in fact sheets and in software. And those percentages are are based on the assumption that the animal is eating a certain amount of food, a certain diet, a certain ratio of forage to concentrate. And so they then calculate that percentage based on that assumption. The latest requirements for small ruminants, nutrient requirements, which are already almost 5 years old now, won't even give you percentages in the tables anymore. It's simply an amount. And it's now all metric. So for those of us in the States, we have to always convert those amounts. Because we're pretty dumb when it comes to the metric system. We have to have our pounds. Where you will see percentages in the books are the individual feedstuffs. They're the logical way to compare feedstuffs. And the table that you see there kind of gives you an idea of how this amount percentages interact. If we were feeding these lambs up here, actually the example I took was for a 132-pound ewe lamb that's in the early part of pregnancy and carrying a single lamb, and she requires 0.34 pounds of crude protein per day, so about a third of a pound. But suppose we just give her free choice of hay, and that's frequently what we do. We give free choice forage. If she eats 3 pounds of hay, or maybe I limit her to 3 pounds of hay because that's all she needs to meet her energy requirements, she actually needs a ration that's 12.9% protein. But as she moves up and eats more hay, either because I give it to her or because she has the ability to eat more hay because she has it out there, you'll notice that her percentage protein goes down. So again, it's not a percent protein she requires, she requires that third of a pound of protein. And what percentage that is depends on how much quantity of food she eats. So that's why, again, I say it's the amounts. We balance rations on amounts, not on percentages. I hope that makes sense. I want to talk about, again, nutritional management, kind of practical feeding of sheep and goats. And I want to look at 3 different groups of animals. Our females, okay, our young stock, our lambs and kids, and finally our bucks and rams. And each one of them listed under them as bullets is kind of the cycle that they go through. You know, a female, she's dry, she breeds, she gets pregnant, she lactates, she weans, she starts all over again. The babies don't tend to start all over again, but they start as newborns, and then they go through various phases, and then of course they enter the herd as they either go to slaughter or enter the herd as a replacement. And then the bucks and the rams, their yearly production cycle is a lot simpler. Most of the year they're just maintenance, but breeding is a very important time for them from a nutritional standpoint. Okay, we're going to start with the females. And this is kind of looking at, I like to think of it as life cycle feeding. And if you lambed or kidded more often than once a year, if you did accelerated, obviously it would be a little bit different than this. This is basically looking at an annual kidding or lambing and what happens in a year. And it's pretty much the same whether it's a meat animal, a fiber animal, or a dairy animal. The same cycle, basically. So again, she starts out dry. You know, she's not doing anything. We simply maintain her, weight equilibrium. Then we're going to breed her. Then she's going to get pregnant. Then she's going to lactate. Either her babies are going to nurse, or we're going to milk her for the milk. And then we're going to either wean the babies, or in the case of a dairy animal, we're going to be drying her off. I mean, but either case, whether it's dairy or nursing, it's the same thing that happens. And nutrition is different in each of these, and even within gestation and lactation, which is the majority of where our nutritional dollars go, there's differences between early versus late gestation. Same thing with lactation, especially for dairy animals, and also maybe for late weaning. Okay, so the first period we're going to talk about is the dry period, and I'm going to apologize ahead of time. Some of these slides are pretty crowded. I've got a lot of information on them. I tried to present examples, pick animals to give you an example with. I tried to pick a dairy doe, a non-dairy doe, and a ewe as we go through each of these cycles and give you some idea of what she would require in her diet to kind of make the points, the generalizations make sense. When the female is dry, assuming she's a mature female, she's typically recovering from lactation, again, whether she's a parlor milked dairy animal or a animal that produced, nursed her kids or lambs. And she's preparing to get rebred. And so during this period, it's kind of a weight equilibrium period, but it's also a period of time when we need her to rebuild her body condition and rebuild her reserves. At the same time, we don't want to get her too fat. We want to get her back in breeding condition. How long this period is, for example, how long you have to get an animal back in breeding condition, or how long a period of time you need to maintain these animals, it depends on birthing interval. Again, if you're accelerated lambing or kidding, that dry period is going to be much shorter. And then if you're lactating goats, that period is also going to be short because we milk goats for a significantly longer time than we typically milk sheep, although some sheep we can milk over 200 days. Somebody raised a hand, Annette and Stephen from New York. I can't really give you a mic, but if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat box. Okay, during this dry period or maintenance period, and also we can include in this group, for the most part, pet wethers or even wethers that we kept for fiber production. For the most part, all these animals need is forage, whether that's pasture, browse, or harvested forage, meaning hay or haylage. It's all they need to maintain themselves. They're not doing anything. They're not pregnant, and they're dry, and that's all they need is forage. That's it. So if we look at the table down here, you can see that we go from one place where percentages can be useful. They are useful. Is as a ballpark, you can see, well, this animal needs to consume a certain percentage of his body weight. And I don't know if you remember from the second session, but goats tend to need to consume a higher percentage of their body weight to maintain their body than sheep do. Conversely, sheep need to eat a higher percentage of their body weight than, say, a cow does or an alpaca does. A dairy goat also needs to eat a higher percent of its body in dry matter. And so, you can see none of them have very high protein requirements. And again, remember this protein requirements assuming they're consuming the amount of feed you see there. And I use as an example the ewe. She requires 2.86 pounds of dry matter. We divide that by 88, which is basically how much dry matter most of our feeds have. And that ewe needs to be fed 3.25 pounds of hay per day. So if you didn't have pasture, or she was dry during a time of the year when you didn't have pasture, or you didn't want to put her on pasture, you could maintain her on 3.25 pounds of hay. And very low protein, 7.2%. That's not very high protein in a hay. So that's what you could do with her. If the animal was on pasture, she'd need to eat about 12 pounds of dry matter pasture. Pasture is about 25% dry matter. Now, we never know how much they're eating. We use a lot of figures for pasture consumption to plan grazing programs, but we really never know exactly what they're eating. DMI does equal dry matter intake. All ration balancing is based on dry matter intake. And of course, Willie will get into that next week. And so to get what we actually put in the feed trough, and we call that as fed, we have to divide by the percent moisture. If it was corn silage, for example, very, very wet feed, then obviously that would also be a high number like the pasture number. But that just kind of gives you a general idea that when these animals are not pregnant and they're not lactating, their nutritional requirements are not very high. Not very high. And I would say, personal opinion, if you gave this ewe access to all the hay she wanted, she would eat too much and probably get too fat. So sometimes you actually need to restrict certain breeds. You need to restrict the amount of hay they get or restrict their access to pasture so they don't get too fat. Fat's not good. We don't like fat. Next step in her cycle is to get her pregnant. And the nutrient requirements, if you look at the tables for those same 3 animals, the nutrient requirements for breeding are only about 10% above maintenance. So typically they're still on pasture or still consuming forage. And they have free access to it, so it's not like we balance it and give them 10% more pasture or 10% more hay. One of the aspects of breeding where nutrition is concerned is the concept of flushing. Flushing is when you give the female a diet so that she will be gaining weight as she goes into the breeding season. It's a very common practice in sheep. It's advocated in meat goats as well. And the idea is that because you have her in a weight-gaining situation, she is going to ovulate more eggs, which should lead to a higher lambing or kidding rate. We always got to remember it's the ovulation rate that sets the upper limit for reproduction. It's the female that determines the litter size, not the male. There's some differences between males and embryo survival, but for the most part, those eggs that female ovulates sets the upper potential. And so flushing has been shown to increase ovulation rates and thus birthing rates. Typically it's done by supplementing females with about a half a pound of grain per head per day. Or you can simply move them to a better pasture, one that you've specifically saved for breeding. You want to start the supplement 2 weeks before the breeding season is scheduled to start and continue 3 to 4 weeks into the breeding season. What the research has shown is that if ewes are already, or does are, already in good body condition, average or better, and the last thing we're going to talk about today is body condition scoring, probably the most important aspect of nutrition. But if they're already average or better, they usually don't respond to flushing. And I think where flushing came about was a lot of females, say out on the range, they weren't in very good body condition when it was time to breed. And so flushing kind of tried to compensate for that body condition, getting them to gain weight, getting them to be in better condition so they'd ovulate more eggs. If females are already in good body condition, they're going to have a high ovulation rate. I actually did some of this work in my graduate program. We actually looked at flushing, and this was in Rambouillet ewes, and it had no effect because they were in decent body condition. So should you feed them grain before breeding? If they're already in good body condition, it's probably not money well spent. However, if you can move them to a better pasture, I think that's certainly going to be money well spent. Okay, now that she's pregnant, and again I apologize, this is an extremely busy slide, but the first, say, 100 days of pregnancy, again assuming they're pregnant for about 142 to 150 days, what's occurring right now? It's always important to think about what's occurring to see how nutrition affects, how the nutrient requirements factor into that. Well, about day 20 to 24 is when the embryos will actually implant into the uterus. Very important time. Don't want to stress her. There's going to be development of her mammary gland, or udder, throughout a good bit of this mid-pregnancy. Placenta development is really important. And again, that's occurring primarily in mid-pregnancy. The other thing that's important for those of you who focus on wool production, and I don't know if the timeline's exactly the same in say, Angora goats, but the follicles, the primary and the secondary follicles are forming on these fetuses. And so if nutrition's not good, you can affect that, and that can affect subsequent wool production. If I look at the table that I've created for those same 3 animals, the 132-pound does and the 176-pound ewe, the difference in those nutritional requirements are quite variable. But for these particular 3 females, anywhere from 16 to 33% increase in nutrient requirements. But at this stage, the quantity of nutrients is more important than the quality of nutrients. Again, look at the protein requirements. Based on that dry matter, they're still all below 10%. So protein is not real high. The TDN, they're all about 53%. That's not the greatest hay in the world, 53%. So you can actually get by feeding lower quality feedstuffs. Again, doesn't have to be your best hay. You can, we want them not to lose weight. We don't want them to get fat. We want them to gain a minimal amount of weight. For a sheep, it's about 1/10 of a pound a day. They're going to gain much more weight in the latter part of pregnancy. So again, if I look at that, in this case, I'm looking at this doe, this 132-pound doe. She needs about 3.6 pounds of hay at this time in her life. If we divided that by 0.24, that would give us the amount of pasture she needs to consume. I think that's what was supposed to be at the bottom of the table, and I didn't complete the arithmetic. But again, she needs that 3.15, so to convert it to actually how much I put in her feed trough, it's 3.6. And with hay, when you think about it, if you were actually going to feed what they need, you were going to balance rations and say, well, she needs 3.6 pounds, we've got to assume some loss in hay. So there's going to be some wastage. So we would actually feed her more than 3.6 pounds. Versus if we had a set amount of grain we were feeding, we usually don't have any waste with that. So this is a very important time, and severe undernutrition can have an impact on lots of things. But at the same time, it's not a high nutritional requirement. It's important, but not a high nutritional requirement on any of these animals, including the dairy female. One of the things that's different about dairy sheep versus dairy goats, at least in the nutrient requirements, everything in the goat requirements, nutrient requirements, is separated by dairy versus non-dairy, everything. In sheep, they only separate the dairy sheep out in lactation. So I don't know if it's because the research hasn't been done, but basically it's the same requirements in maintenance, in early pregnancy, late pregnancy, for meat use, fiber use, and dairy use. But once lactation begins, we have a separate set of requirements for dairy use, which interestingly enough are not significantly different than used nursing triplets. Not significantly different. If you would ask me when is the most important time of nutrition, it would be late pregnancy, after day 100. The last 50 days, the last 6 to 8 weeks, the very most important time. A lot of other, in lactation and in growing and finishing lambs and kids, a lot of times that is based on how well you want them to perform. But in late gestation, you're not judging how you want them to perform. You need to meet their requirements, or you can have potential consequences. There was a question about the 3.15 and 0.24. I forgot to finish it. I was trying to give an example of 3.15 pounds of dry matter divided by 24%, which would be the dry matter on say, orchard grass, how many pounds of dry matter of pasture she'd have to consume, and I did not complete my arithmetic, and that's what that is. What's happening during late pregnancy, of course, is the fetuses are growing very rapidly. And think, too, one fetus is growing rapidly, 2 fetuses might be growing rapidly, 3 fetuses might be growing rapidly. So it's even more significant on the females carrying multiple births. This is going to limit the rumen capacity. So she would, how much feed she can actually consume. Theoretically, no matter what the nutritional requirements of an animal are, if they had no limit on what they could eat, forage could meet all their needs. But they do have a limit. They do have a limit on what they can eat. And then, of course, mammary development is also very important during this stage. During late gestation, it is usually necessary to supplement either high moisture feeds, which would be not just silage, but it would be pasture, particularly lush spring growth. And then also going to the other end, our dry forages, it's usually necessary to supplement them with concentrate feeds to meet the nutritional requirements. This is especially true, again, for females carrying multiple births. Again, I don't care if it's a dairy female, a fiber female, or a meat female. The example of our 3 ewes, in order for this ewe to meet her nutritional requirements, she'd have to eat 5 pounds of hay, a 176-pound ewe. And, you know, is it possible? Probably, but it's probably better to feed a more nutrient-dense diet. The nutrient most likely to be deficient is energy. No doubt about it, energy. If you look at protein requirements, they do go up a little bit more on the goats, but they're still not very high. 10% is not very high. Most any grass hay, unless it's really awful, is going to be 10%. Okay, so it's the energy requirements that go up the most. The other thing that goes up, and I didn't put it on the table, but is calcium. Calcium requirements are very important during late pregnancy. So during this time, we don't want to feed low-quality feeds. So if you do strictly feed forage, it needs to be high-quality forage, high-quality hay. You know, instead of that 53.3% TDN, at least 58 or maybe 60% TDN, a really good quality hay. And then maybe she can eat enough. We don't want to put them on low-quality pasture. They need higher quality feed. They need more nutrient-dense feed. The concentrates make it easy to do that. If you're predominantly forage-based, you simply need to really concentrate on high-quality forage. We don't want to overfeed during this period. You know, I talk a lot about meeting the requirements and not underfeeding them, but there are equal consequences to overfeeding. And I think this next slide, I kind of contrast poor nutrition. What happens if poor nutrition is both underfeeding and overfeeding? It's interesting, some of the symbols that I use in the PowerPoint presentation have been converted to unique characters. The characters, the energy, the character in front of energy is supposed to be an arrow that goes down, meaning if you have insufficient energy in the diet, we can get ketosis. The symbol before ketosis is supposed to be an arrow going up, meaning less energy, more chance of ketosis or pregnancy toxemia. I don't know why it converts the symbols in this program. When the PowerPoints are uploaded to SlideShare, the symbols just look fine. Not enough calcium in the diet is going to increase our chances of milk fever. So those are 2 very significant nutritional disorders that we are going to talk about the last session when we talk about nutritional and metabolic problems. The other consequences of underfeeding are weaker kids and lambs. We can get lower, small birth weights. This can lead to higher neonatal mortality. We can have poorer quality and poorer quantity of colostrum, which is the first milk. Again, that's going to contribute to mortality. Less milk production. The kids and lambs aren't going to grow as well. Obviously, if it's a dairy animal that we're milking, we're not going to get as high a production. And as I mentioned before, that poor nutrition during gestation can have an effect on the future fiber production of the offspring. The consequences of overfeeding can also be bad. The list isn't as long. That's only because I just used primarily one word, and that's dystocia. Dystocia just means difficult lambing. This was one of my ewes years ago, and I remember she was fat, and she had difficulty lambing. I think during this lambing she had 1 live lamb and one lost one lamb. When you overfeed, say before late gestation, you just get your ewes too fat, there's a lot less room in there. And remember, we're already taking up a lot of room inside because of the fetuses growing. Lost my train of thought there for a second. We've got lots of forage in the room, and that's taking up a lot of room. We've got more fat inside. That's taking up room. It's harder for those babies to get repositioned. If we overfeed, especially during late pregnancy, we can increase the size of the fetuses. If we simply have a difficult birth, we get the baby out live, it's still more likely to die if it had a difficult birth. So we could lose babies, or we could just compromise babies. As Susan Kerr mentions, vaginal prolapses can be a consequence of overfeeding. during late pregnancy. I often tell people, again, you got an animal that's full of babies, a rumen full of forage, and a body full of fat, and sometimes something's got to give. So she pushes her vagina out. Hopefully, you can keep it in until she lambs her kids, and a lot of times that corrects the problem. I think it's certainly more of a problem with sheep than it is with goats, but it can certainly occur with goats. So there's a lot of things that being over-conditioned or feeding late pregnancy can do to affect your success at lambing season. So I just use that one word, dystocia, to cover it all, but lots of things can go wrong. And then the other thing is, I always want to remind people that overfeeding costs dollars. Underfeeding costs dollars too. They're just sometimes you don't write a check for them. You don't pay for them. When you overfeed, you're buying more feed and you're feeding more feed, so there's a cost to it. So we want to feed the right nutrition. Okay, lactation. Certainly this is where the highest nutritional requirements are. I don't care, again, what kind of animal it is, sheep, goat, dairy, meat. It's the highest. We spend the most amount of money feeding during lactation. This is where the majority of our cost in our operation is. Need more energy, need more protein, more minerals, more vitamins. This is when they need the highest nutrition. When we consider forage, whether it's a dry forage or a fresh forage, the very best forage should be saved for lactation. I think there's some chat in the chat box, some dialogue about alfalfa. If you have alfalfa hay, pure alfalfa hay, you should save it for lactation. The reason is it's the highest quality forage. They don't need that much protein in late pregnancy, so that's a waste of money. You can risk milk fever because you can actually have a problem with milk fever with too much calcium. Most of the time we think of it, at least with meat animals, as not enough calcium in that diet, but you can feed too much. But reality is they do not need alfalfa during late pregnancy. They don't need that good a quality forage. And so saving it for late, just for lactation, makes the most sense in the world. Alfalfa is the best quality forage. You want to save it for the animals with the highest nutritional requirements. Now, of course, there's certainly some differences in the fact that not all alfalfa hay is good quality. And also sometimes people only have one hay. They don't have very many animals and they only have one hay. What I would rather see people do is, if you want to feed alfalfa during late pregnancy, maybe feed alfalfa in the morning and feed grass at night. Feed more of a kind of a mix. The nutrient requirements during lactation, of course, are also affected by a lot of different things. The young female, the yearling, she has a higher nutritional requirement, usually a denser ration, because she's smaller, so she's not actually going to eat more, but she needs a denser ration. Obviously, a female nursing twins needs more than one nursing singles. One nursing triplets obviously needs more than one nursing twins. Those in an accelerated lambing kidding program, really when you think about it, they need more nutrients in the sense that you don't have a lot of time for them to recover their body conditions. So if you let their body conditions significantly decline, the next time they're ready to breed in that accelerated system, one, they may not breed, or two, they may only ovulate one egg. So the nutritional requirements you need to also keep an eye on body condition in an accelerated program. In an annual program, I can let body condition decline more because I've got more time for that female to recruit. Obviously, significant differences in dairy females versus non-dairy females. And really not just dairy versus non-dairy, but even within dairy. If you look at the tables of the nutrient requirements for dairy goats, they list them for both those that are nursing their offspring and those that are milked in a parlor. And what I assume milked in a parlor means is it's a production system where we're trying to maximize milk production. If you look at the sheep requirements, parlor milked ewes are a separate category. We don't have dairy ewes that nurse their lambs. We don't have requirements for them. So again, we're looking at more of a maximum production. The dairy goats actually, I think in my next slide I can show this, the dairy goats actually list the requirements as far as whether she's they kind of give 3 levels of production. So in this particular table, I've got a a dairy doe, a regular meat or fiber doe, a ewe, and a dairy ewe. And if you just you can get a general idea looking at the quantities of nutrients that they require, and based on that dry matter intake, the percentages of the nutrients. And take particular note of our dairy doe, our average producer, and you can look up how many pounds of milk that actually means, but she needs a diet she needs to eat 5% of her body weight. So that's 6.5 pounds of feed, dry matter feed, so it's more than 6.5. She needs to have a ration that's 80% TDN. There isn't a forage in the world that's 80% TDN. So to actually meet the nutritional requirements of this dairy doe at that level of production, obviously you're going to have to feed a lot of concentrates. And her protein requirement is also very high. Now, we can get forages that are 21% crude protein. Good alfalfa hay can be. So where the diet is going to need the concentrates is to get that TDN up. The meat goat doe has the lowest requirements of any of the 4 animals up there. The requirements for our ewe nursing twins, pretty dense ration, 70% TDN. And again, you're not going to find any forage that's 70% TDN. You could find fresh growing forages, but you're going to come back to that moisture problem of can she eat enough to meet those requirements. Pretty high protein requirement for this ewe. And our dairy ewe, at least according to the tables, we're putting a lot more feed into her, and therefore her percent nutrient, her percent energy, and her percent protein are actually lower than the meat ewe. And if I were to put ewe with triplets up there, her requirements would be significantly higher than the ewe that's third down. So you can see our requirements really go up as production goes up. So until we balance rations next week and you see actually, here's how we could actually do it, we have a lot of just kind of rules of thumb we tend to follow. Kind of like saying that we can meet the nutritional requirements of a dry ewe with just forage. We're not balancing ration, that's just something that tends to work. Well, some of the rules of thumb for sheep are 1 pound of grain for each lamb a ewe is nursing. I'll tell you, that's the one I follow. I feed 1 pound of grain for each lamb the ewe is nursing. So that's, if she's got twins, she gets 2 pounds. If she's got triplets, she gets 3 pounds. And a lot of people use that. The other thing is if you got the sheep out on pasture, and I've even seen this recommendation for dairy ewes out on pasture, is 1 pound of grain. 1 pound of grain. Versus the significantly higher amount if you've got them in a barn situation where you're feeding hay and grain. When you're utilizing good quality pasture, just an extra pound a day. And a lot of what that does is maintain body condition, to be honest with you. A lot of that maintains body condition. Some of it's going to translate into more milk, but some of it's going to give you better body condition. Common recommendation in meat goats, you'll see it in a lot of fact sheets, and it's almost like across the board. It doesn't matter whether it's a kid, a buck, or a doe, but it's to feed 1 pound a day of a 16% crude protein ration, assuming the forage alone is not meeting those needs. And again, I think feeding the doe, if it's poor quality pasture or poor quantity of pasture, that extra pound is probably going to give you more milk and more growth, and some of it's going to maintain body condition. When you got them out on pasture and we get into the parasite season, I think that pound of 16% crude protein ration can be pretty important for a meat goat doe, or even for a meat goat kid. A lot of times dairy goats, the amount of concentrate is often equated to the amount of milk that they're producing. I think of dairy goats and dairy sheep as being far more sophisticated production than meat and fiber, and I would never follow a rule of thumb. I would flat out balance rations. You're putting a lot of more feed into those animals, you're getting a lot more product to sell out of those animals, and you really shouldn't use rules of thumb. We should actually balance the ration. And fortunately, the new nutrient requirements really have those requirements fine-tuned for different types of goats or different stages of production, and now we have the requirements for dairy sheep. And in order to do some of this, like if you think about the idea of feeding 1 pound of grain for each baby that's being nursed, I actually did that for my meat goats too. You have to separate them. You have to separate them. And of course, if you just have a few animals, that might be easy because you can hand feed them. If you've got kind of 20 animals or something, that gets kind of hard. but if you've got enough facilities, it really will pay to separate them into production groups. I usually separate mine into twins and triplets, and I'll get a couple of singles, and unfortunately they'll probably be overfed. I'll also separate my yearlings. So the more you can separate, the more you can meet the individual needs. Otherwise, you're going to feed 2 pounds of grain, and the ewes with triplets aren't getting enough, and the ewes with singles are getting too much. Okay, we're going to switch now to the babies, the lambs and kids. And we're going to, again, they kind of go through a production cycle too. We start with the newborn or the neonatal, and then we've got the period of time when they're nursing their mother. And then that may end for you. That may be as far as yours go. Or you may wean them, and then we've got the period after weaning. What are we going to do with them? And I've got us going in two different directions, animals that we're going to feed for market, slaughter animals versus replacements. Primarily what we're talking here is replacement females, does, and ewes. Let's talk about the newborn. Well, the key to nutrition on the newborn is colostrum. That's the first milk that's produced after they lamb and kid. It's available for, you can actually, if you look it up on the internet, if you wanted to answer the question, how long does a ewe or doe produce colostrum, and for how long is it available to the lamb and kid, you will find a range of numbers. But most of us go on the idea that you got to get that colostrum in them the first 24 hours. You know, we base a lot of recommendations on how much they should consume in 24 hours. Colostrum is a tremendous source of nutrition for the young ruminant. It's obviously got the nutrients of energy, fat, and protein, very high source of vitamin A. The antibodies. Here you could talk about, well, we're vaccinated for C, D, and T, and those antibodies are going to pass through the colostrum to the babies and give them passive immunity for, say, at least 6 weeks. They're very large protein molecules, and the baby can only consume them for so long. The immunoglobulins, you know, here we're talking, again, passing immunity to the babies. And this you think of, you know, every kind of bug that could exist in the environment. You know, E. coli. We want that baby to get off to a good head start, and he needs to acquire some of that immunity from his mom as his young immune system begins to develop. Colostrum also has laxative properties. Ideally, that baby should be up within 30 minutes. I remember when this doe of mine kidded. I don't think that baby was more than 30 minutes old, and they were up and nursing. You know, if they wait till 2 hours, are they still going to live? Yeah, probably, and they'll probably get their colostrum, but the faster that baby gets up, the better. And our general rule of thumb is that they should consume 10% of their body weight in their first 24 hours of life. When the babies do their own suckling, it's not really a significant number. Where the 10% comes into play is if we provide the colostrum to them, if we tube feed them or whatever, we want to get 10% of their body weight. You know, a 10-pound lamb is going to need a pound, 16 ounces in that first 24 hours. Like I said, when they consume their own, we never know exactly what that number is. Colostrum substitutes, there's nothing like mom's milk. So the next best source of colostrum would be from another female in the flock, preferably an older female. The next best source would be another farm with sheep or goats. You can use cow milk. It's not as nutritious as sheep milk, for example, so you need to feed a lot more. Yonis is always a concern. The products that are on the market, most of them are just colostrum supplements. They don't have any immunity in them. There may be some new ones on the market. I don't think there's anything yet specific for sheep or goats that has any immunity in it. So the intake of colostrum is affected by two primary things. One is the supply, how much is produced. And females vary in the quality and quantity of colostrum that they produce. And certainly we've talked about nutrition. But generally speaking, older ewes will produce more and better quality colostrum than younger ewes. That's why it's better, if you have a choice, to give colostrum from an older ewe. Even cows, it's better to give colostrum from a colored breed, one that has a higher butter fat. Research shows that if you grain feed during late pregnancy, you will increase colostrum and the quality of colostrum. Okay? Do you have to? That doesn't necessarily mean you have to, but it provides glucose. It provides a substrate for colostrum, And so there's definitely a benefit to feeding grain. The other thing that you could have all the colostrum in the world, but you don't have a lamb or kid that suckles very good. And they vary tremendously in their ability to nurse. And certainly singles nurse more than, or get more colostrum usually than multiples. And how good a mother the ewe or doe is, she should encourage, kind of like this ewes doing in the picture. She needs to encourage those lambs. They don't really know what end of the body it's at. She's got to encourage them. She's got to look after them. She's got to, it's very important. So the amount they actually intake can vary. The thickness of the colostrum can affect it. There's just a lot of different factors. Just some general rules of thumb. If you have the ability, you should get rid of females with poor mothering ability, if you have that option, and those that don't produce enough colostrum, or those who produce colostrum that's too thick. You shouldn't keep lambs or kids that require tube feeding or bottle feeding. You're asking why. To some degree it depends on, actually I can't think of any reason. Okay, I have a reason. She produced a lot of colostrum and she's a good milker and mother, but I ran her over with the four-wheeler by accident. Well, in that case it's not the lamb or kid's fault. But normally, if they were too weak or stupid to nurse and you have to tube feed them, you don't want to keep them. You want to save them, but you don't want to keep them. And bottle feeding, she didn't have enough milk? Nope, I don't want to keep her. I want to raise them, do the best I can, but I don't want to keep them. But if you can totally explain it out, like I said, you ran her over, then it's okay. But we don't always have these choices, but when you have the choices and you can really nitpick on who you pick, who you select, you're going to make real progress in your flock. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the pre-weaning stage. And again, for some people, this could be the entire life of the lamb or kid if they naturally wean. For the first few weeks, all they need is milk. But they're gonna show interest in feed very soon after they're born. And by the time they're, say, 10 weeks old, they really want to be nibbling on stuff. When they're 4 to 6 weeks of age, they could be getting more than half of their nutrients from something other than milk. And as we talked in the first session, what we feed these animals during this period, pre-weaning or just say the early part of ones we don't wean, is going to affect how their rumens develop. Grain, a starter grain, is going to develop that rumen, inoculate that rumen with microbes much quicker than just hay or pasture. In an early weaning situation, or say with bottle babies, you want to get them that rumen functioning as fast as you can. And really, I think in almost all situations you want to get it functioning as fast as you can, but particularly with early weaning and with bottle babies. Just to kind of give you an interesting side thing, at the Spooner Research Station in Wisconsin, which is our dairy sheep research center, our only one, they wean the lambs when they're like 30 days old. They take them away from their mother at 24 hours and then feed them milk replacer for 30 days. And obviously they creep feed them with a grain. They don't give them any hay. They only give them grain, and then after they wean them, they will gradually put forage in the diet, but it's only grain. And two reasons. One, again, the grain develops the rumen, and secondly, hay's pretty tasty. And when you wean them at 30 days of age, which is pretty young, you don't want them gorging on hay. It's not nutritious enough for that 30-day-old animal, and that's why they just do grain. Creep feeding, of course, is a method of providing supplemental nutrition to suckling lambs and kids. Not everybody does it or should do it, and it's not always economical. It depends on the herd and the flock. Typically, the lambs that are creep fed and the kids are ones that are born early in the season, like say January. Those that are part of an accelerated lambing or kidding program because they need to be weaned early. Those that are artificially reared, either in a dairy operation or because the mom couldn't do it. Again, early weaning, getting that rumen going. If you get a lot of multiple births and milk's a limiting factor, it may pay to creep feed. And if you're not having overabundance of pasture, it can make sense to creep feed. What creep feeding does is it eases the stress at weaning. And here what I'm saying is an early weaning, say a 60 days, say a 90 days. Those guys are eating feed, and when they get removed from the milk diet, it's not going to be a real big deal. It's going to improve growth rate. You have to decide whether that improvement in growth rate is worth the cost. And again, it's going to enhance rumen development. A creep area is just an area that we set up in the barn or the pasture. Hopefully by the time the lambs are about 10 days old, when they're really getting interested in eating, we create some sort of barrier that they can get in and their moms can't. These are a couple of my setups. The top one is for lambs out on pasture. These were some early born lambs a couple years ago. And then the one at the bottom, more what I would have in my barn. The area where you locate this creep needs to be very enticing to the babies. It needs to be clean, easy to get to, well lit, dry. It needs to be a nice place for them to hang out. They got to like being in there because you want to encourage them to go in there. The ration, the key thing is that it be fresh and that it tastes good. When we talk about creep feeding young animals, we look at a very high percentage of protein, 17 to 20%. You'll even see higher amounts. If we're creep feeding, say, a 4-month-old lamb or kid, which we could be doing, we can lower that protein percent. Particularly for those older lambs, we need to make sure that calcium to phosphorus ratio is 2 to 1, so we don't invite urinary calculi in our males. Protein needs to be all natural, meaning we couldn't feed urea. It needs to be highly digestible because a 10-day-old lamb or kid doesn't have a functioning rumen. So cracked corn, ground, small particle size. Example ration would be cracked corn and soybean meal, and you could add minerals to that. That's what my lambs are eating on the right, just a simple cracked corn and soybean meal diet. You can also buy starter pellets and feed a pelleted diet. Creep feed always needs to be available. It should never run out. And one of the biggest challenges is the feeder design. I noticed somebody had asked an earlier question about feeders. Feeders can be a challenge, especially with goats. Typically, for creep rations, mine's just a trough with a bar that goes across, or a self-feeder that's kind of gravity-fed. They can work well too. Mine, I can't obviously completely keep their little feet out of there, so I'm constantly cleaning those things. We can also creep graze, provide better quality forage for the lambs and kids that are nursing their dams. The same philosophy as grain feeding is we'll create a barrier that where only the lambs and kids can get through and not the does or ewes. For creep grazing to be legitimate practice, that forage that the kids and lambs have access to must be better than what they have with their moms. And they may even need to be trained to go in there with their moms. And not only must it be better than the forage that their moms have, but it needs to be very high quality. Kind of like that grain ration at 17 to 20%, and corn and soybean meal is very high in nutrition. We need the best possible pasture if creep grazing is going to be a legitimate practice. I've read stuff on the internet or studies that have been done, and it's kind of sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Somebody asked a question about the ratio of corn and soybean meal. There's a simple way to balance that. You know, if you want an 18% ration, it's what we call the Pearson square. And Willie's going to go over some of that kind of stuff in the next session, or when we're finished I can show you an example of how we do that. Now we're at the post-weaning time. You know, we're ready to separate the babies from the mother. Well, that could be 60 days. It could be 150 days, you know, because people wean at different times. For some of you, you might wean and send them to market because you didn't wean them, or you wean them very late. So we're not really having a post-weaning feeding period. If you wean them before you sell them, then we have a period of time where we're going to need to feed them. And I'm going to divide that into two groups: the market animals, the slaughter animals, the young stock, and then the replacements, because I think they should be done differently. And then as I look at the market animals, I'm going to look at, well, am I going to finish them on pasture, or am I going to finish them in some sort of dry lot situation? So I don't have enough time, obviously, to cover the details of feeding every class of animal. And so for talking about lambs and kids, what I thought I'd do is just kind of compare kind of three common systems for finishing lambs and kids. With pasture, strictly or mostly pasture being one system, the kind of polar opposite of that would be a kind of a high energy or high concentrate diet. And then where I think a lot of people might be is somewhere in the middle sometimes. You know, it's not one extreme or the other. So in a pasture finishing situation, these are typically, but not always, lambs that are born later, say later in the spring, and they go to their on pasture with their dams. We tend to wean later. You know, we don't wean 60 days and put these lambs and kids on pasture. At least I don't think you should. In terms of growth, they're not generally going to grow as fast as lambs that are fed concentrates. And I think that a pasture system is best for animals or breeds or genetics with low to moderate growth potential. Take the typical Suffolk show animal. Big frame, late maturing. Not the type of genetics you're likely going to want to finish on pasture. Conversely, Texels, Dorsets, Southdowns, they still have the potential to grow decent, but they have the ability to finish on pasture. If we look at the goat side, the meat goats or the kind of the indigenous goats are probably a better choice than growing dairy wethers on pasture. To make a pasture system work, high quality is the key. High quality is the key. You may creep graze, you may even supplemental feed on pasture. You can creep feed on pasture. Switch to that other extreme, the high concentrate, high energy diet. This tends to be our early born lambs, ones we wean early. Again, ones with high growth potential. If I'm going to feed an expensive high energy feed, I want to make sure I'm feeding an animal that's going to do something with it. Dairy, it can be quite common to do this, and I know especially in a dairy sheep operation where those lambs are weaned early. You keep them on that diet and move with them. Typically, what we mean in this system is we have them locked in a pen or whatever, or a dry lot, and they don't graze, so they don't have a source of parasites. High energy feed, typically self-fed, meaning we give them free choice. Pelleted ration works very well for this because they can't sort. That pelleted ration may also include forage. It can kind of be a complete mixture. Doesn't necessarily have to be a high energy pellet. You could actually have a more intermediate pellet. Tend to limit, if forage isn't included in that pellet to any large degree, sometimes you will kind of limit feed hay. And this system tends to produce maximum gain, which may or may not be the most profitable. It just depends. Combination in the middle, kind of how we're going to grow goats at our research center this year. We're going to keep them away from grazing in a zero grazing pen, but they're going to have all the forage they can eat, and we're going to limit feed them grain. We're going to feed them grain once a day. This is also the system that I use for my own sheep. I feed a mixed ration, a whole grain ration, and that way they have to eat everything they get, so they're not going to pick through it. If I'm going to full feed animals, self-feed animals, I want them not to be able to pick. I'm going to feed a pelleted ration. If I'm going to limit feed them, which I would typically do to ewes or does or in kind of this more moderate finishing system, then I can utilize mixed grains, textured feeds, whole grain-based rations. This system is kind of more middle of the road in a lot of ways. It allows them to put some frame on. They continue to grow, but not quite as fast. They kind of can put on more frame before they get totally finished. I think it's an excellent or a preferable system for goats and hair sheep because of the way they fatten inside out. If you feed goats and hair sheep high concentrate, high energy diets on maximum gain, you're not going to produce a very good quality product. They're really going to get fat. Okay. So I think that different genetics can tend to suit different ones. Looks like we're at the hour point, but I just got a few more slides. One is the replacements. And here I primarily mean ewe lambs and doelings. Ideally, you should separate them out from your slaughter animals, from your market animals. You should not feed them for maximum rate of gain. You can find in the literature a recommendation of anywhere from 50 to 75% of their maximum gain. This can typically be done on strictly forage. I would say a good quality forage. You can feed them a pound of grain a day. I know this is the system I use for my ewe lambs. That the top picture is one of my Katahdin mules, 3/4 Katahdin, quarter blackface. I feed them a pound of grain, kind of steady all the way through until they have their lambs, and then I increase their diet. We wouldn't necessarily feed a goat a whole pound if he's only 40 pounds, so sometimes we look at percentage of body weight, a half to 1% of their body weight in grain for goats. Again, but they're still consuming forage, and if we want a little bit better growth, we add some grain to that ration. If I'm going to breed ewe lambs and doe kids the first year, I'm going to supplement them all along. If I'm going to wait till they're a year, if I'm going to wait till they're a year and a half, I might take them on strictly forage on a slower growth. In our replacements, frame development is more important than finish. There's some evidence to suggest that if you grow them too fast and they deposit fat in the udder, this can affect their future milk producing ability. There's data on meat sheep, there's data on heifers. Interestingly enough, University of Wisconsin did a study with dairy ewes, and they actually concluded that they should full feed those dairy ewes. It did not affect their production. But a lot of the other data would suggest that you don't want to full feed them and get them to deposit fat in their udder. The males, during most of the year, forage is all that they need to meet their nutritional requirements. And again, that forage could be hay, pasture, or browse. The only time we really need to supplement them with concentrates is if we need to either maintain or build their body condition. I mean, it's true, some animals probably don't get enough, or some males won't get enough feed out of forage. Again, a big frame, late maturing ram, it might be hard enough for them to maintain good body condition on forage alone, so this is where we might supplement them. Always a good idea to have free choice minerals. If we do supplement them, again, we need to keep in mind that ratio of calcium to phosphorus. One of the goals that we have is that at the time of breeding that those bucks be in good body condition, 3 to 4, out of a scale of 1 to 5, and we're going to talk about body condition, I think, in the next slide. So if they're not in that body condition when breeding season is approaching, we need to feed grain. Kind of think of it as flushing the ram or buck just like the ewes. Continue feeding it through the breeding season. Pay particular attention to our young males, our ram, lambs, and bucklings. Not only might they need more nutrition for the breeding activity, but they're also continuing to grow. Most males, in fact I say most good males, will lose weight lose body condition during the breeding season, and some will practically starve themselves to get their job done. That's bad on one hand because you don't want them to be nutritionally compromised, but I guess that shows how aggressive a breeder they are. Once the breeding season's over, it may be necessary to supplement them to get them to rebuild their body condition back to, say, a 3. So for the most part, males can survive on forage, but when we need to manipulate their body condition for whatever reason, that's where concentrate feeding comes into play. Last thing I want to talk about real quickly is body condition scoring. Because if you never take the time to balance rations, like we're going to cover next week, if you never look at the tables, if you never do the math, you never weigh your sheep, you never weigh your feed, body condition scoring can be your savior. Grain does not cause urinary calculi in bucks or rams. Urinary calculi is generally a result of an improper balance between calcium and phosphorus. Grains like corn, barley, oats are high in phosphorus and low in calcium. If you fed straight grains as the only thing the animal ate, you would be inviting urinary calculi. But when I say supplement with grain, either that grain is going along with a forage or that's a complete grain ration. And sometimes I think it gets confusing, some of the words we use, grain versus concentrate, and I think maybe that's a little bit where the confusion is. But you always have to be aware of that percentage of calcium and phosphorus. They also always need to have forage, always. They need to get enough salt in their diet. They need to drink plenty of water. In situations where you can't control it, like on lambs and kids, typically ammonium chloride is added to the diet. Back to body condition scoring. What body condition scoring allows you to do is evaluate what you've been feeding. What you've been feeding. What you've been feeding. Was it right? Was it enough? Don't look at necessarily an individual animal, but the average in your flock. If they're too skinny, you obviously haven't been feeding them enough. Maybe you couldn't, or maybe you didn't know how. But now you know that I need to do something different in the future. They're thin. I need them in this kind of body condition score. The other thing body condition score is used is to assess their health status. When we look at the goats at our research center to decide whether to deworm them, we don't just look at FOMACHA scores. We do what we call the 5-point check. Included in the 5-point check is the FOMACHA score, bottle jaw, body condition score, DAG score, and nasal bots. So body condition score is a very important indicator of health. But mostly it tells us it evaluates what we have been feeding and gives an idea of what we need to be feeding. Body condition scoring is typically done on a scale of 1 to 5. Occasionally you'll see a goat scale 1 to 9, and other species will use maybe a 1 to 9. I think cats and dogs and cows and horses are 1 to 9. Sheep and goats tend to be 1 to 5. The only difference between 1 to 5 and 1 to 9 is we use half scores. 1 is emaciated, very thin, too thin. 5 is obese. 3 is average. We want our sheep and goats to be between 2 and 4. We assess body condition score by feeling for fat and or muscle over the backbone, the ribs, the spine, and the loin. These pictures on this slide actually show you basically going back over the loin. If you have to do it quickly, you really only need to grab the loin because you're feeling for the fullness of the muscle and you're feeling for the amount of fat cover over those spinous processes. Body condition scoring is relative. You need to be consistent. It's going to feel different if it's a goat versus a sheep, a dairy goat versus a meat goat, a wool sheep versus a hair sheep. It's relative. For example, you don't want goats as fat as sheep, and you don't want hair sheep as fat as wool sheep. That kind of gets to their differences in how they fat. What our goal should be is, again, the sheep, goats, always between 2 and 4. So that's kind of thin, average, and fat. Never 1s and 5s. Never emaciated, never obese. And you ought to look at getting rid of those. Sometimes those can be temporary conditions that can be corrected, but sometimes you just need to get rid of them. You know, very often a 1 might be a very old animal that just can't hold her body condition anymore, or one that gets extremely sick. Some goals: you body condition score at key different times of the year. In breeding season, you want them in a average body condition. I might actually say 3+ instead of just 3. Late gestation, again, average body condition. By the time she lambs, I want her on the plus side, 3 to 4, 3+. And when she weans her lambs, I want her down at 2. If she's still at 3, started at 3.5 and stayed at 3.5, it makes me wonder what she was doing with that feed, putting too much body condition score on. I want her to lose some body condition. 2 is about where I want her. Rams and bucks, again, 3 most of the year, a little bit better than 3 when we approach that breeding season, because again, that fella's going to lose some weight if he's doing his job. So this is where we want our animals. This is just something you should do all the time. I never touch a sheep without body condition scoring it. Never. You should do it at before breeding, at weaning, at different times, and you should strive for these goals. Be consistent is the main thing. There's no always rights and wrongs. And there can even be some different goals based on where you're at. You go to the western United States where they're producing a lot of good quality fine wool. The sheep stay out on the range year round. My goal for body condition might not be a 3. I might rather have them in a 2 because too good a nutrition is actually going to make the fibers coarser. So there can be differences in different parts of the country. There can be differences in different size operations. But this is kind of a general, I'm going to say, for a lot of our smaller flocks. And I'm thinking, my one last slide. This is what Willie's going to talk about next week. He's going to talk about how feeding livestock is like making spaghetti. He doesn't actually know he's going to talk about this, but a couple years ago a producer said you really need to simplify how you teach nutrition, and he said he ought to compare it to spaghetti. So I thought about it, and I thought, that makes sense because we don't want to just eat spaghetti without all the ingredients. So think of the pasta as the energy. That's the majority of what we eat. Think of the meatballs as the protein, because that's the other really important thing. And then the sauce, that's the minerals, because it's maybe not as big a quantity, but it's very important. And think of the vitamins as some sort of cheese topping. But the whole concept is that you don't just eat spaghetti by itself, although my mother does. She eats it dry with butter sometimes. But you need to have all these ingredients. They're all important, and they're important at different levels. And so he's going to talk about actually balancing rations. And I think we should occasionally do that. I like carbs. It can be whole wheat pasta. But anyhow, he's going to go into the actual mechanics of ration balancing and some of the tools that make it easy. And like I said, I think occasionally you need to do that.